My name is Matt Taylor. I'm an associate professor in the School of International Service here at American University, or actually down the road at American University. And we're really happy to have all of you with us today for the second part of legislative effectiveness in Latin America. For those of you who may have happened into this call and aren't sure what's going on, this is indeed about Latin America, although our speakers today will be talking mainly about the United States. And this follows our great interest in drawing comparative lessons from the United States for Latin America and vice versa. Before beginning, let me just thank the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies that's sponsoring today's event. And Eric Hirschberg, the director of the center, is here with us. Also, a special shout out to Beatriz Hay, who has organized both of these events and has been sort of the spearhead from the get-go. I won't take too much of your time right now, except to just remind you of the basic protocol. I'd ask that while you're not speaking, you put you hit your mute button, and if you have any questions, you can place those in the chat. We'll keep the presentations relatively short. Each of the presenters has agreed to present for 8 minutes, and I'll be keeping time, and then we'll open it up for what I hope will be a vibrant discussion like the discussion that we had last time around. We don't have a designated discussant, which means that we anticipate that everybody will play that role. Without further ado then, let me make sure that I can get the PowerPoint going, and we'll go to our first presentation by Andrew Ballard and James Curry. So just a moment while I share. And when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay.
I can see the PowerPoint.
I can.
Great.
Hi, folks. For those of you who I haven't met yet, I'm Andy Ballard. I'm an assistant professor at American University in the Department of Government. And this is some work that I'm doing with Jim Curry at the University of Utah on minority party leverage in the US Congress. So you can go to the next slide. So basically what we want to know is when and under what conditions can the minority party actually influence the House agenda. Next, please. This comes from a number of places, particularly when you read the literature on parties in Congress, the dominant focus is on the majority party. Two of the biggest theories of party operations in Congress are procedural cartel theory, Cox and McCubbin's, which expects that the House majority parties will block action on issues that divide it, and conditional party government. Aldrich and Rhodey expects that House majority parties will advance bills on issues that unify it. Now, we're focusing on those two things in particular because those drive aspects of the theory that we develop in terms of when the minority party should have leverage over the agenda, but also to highlight the idea that while the way that these theories are viewed, and honestly a lot of the actual writing that Cox and McCubbin and Aldrich and Rhodey have done focuses on the assumed dominance of the majority party, we want to figure out where the limits to that power is and what the minority can actually do to influence legislation. Next. Right, because there are actually good reasons to believe that there might be limits to a majority party agenda setting. Particularly, there are lots of additional influences on the political agenda, things like non-discretionary items, things that members of Congress actually have to pass. There are other agenda setters, the Senate and the president. There's a lot of public pressure that can influence the items that Congress considers. And then also the broader political system has implications for what Congress does, right? Bipartisanship is actually required for most enactments, not like explicitly required in the Constitution, but de facto required based on the makeup of who is actually in Congress. And then also the separation of powers and the electoral system that we have actually undermine party unity. Next. So we developed a theory that argues that the minority party has influence over the agenda and then is conditional on three things. One, opportunity. to engage, to influence the agenda. This can come from things like public opinion, the disunity of the majority party or bicameral policymaking. Second, the cohesion to actually, get their troops in line and go try and influence the agenda, like unity within the minority party. And three, the motivation to influence, to actually engage in lawmaking rather than electioneering, say. Next, please. And so what we do is we test this theory by operationalizing each of those ideas: opportunity, cohesion, and motivation. And then we look at all the bills in the 99th through the 109th Congresses. The choice of those particular years is important, and we talk about that a lot in the paper. It's largely a function of we need enough data for enough years in a certain number of ways. But we did remove all non-substantive bills to the degree that we can. And then what we did was we modeled whether each bill reached a final passage vote and also whether it became law. So not only are we looking at the things that the House takes up, but also the sort of downstream legislative implications. Next. And so how we think about operationalizing these three constructs: opportunity, cohesion, and motivation. Opportunity and cohesion, we operationalize as inter-party heterogeneity across policy issues. And so what we did was separately for the majority and the minority party, estimated W nominate on bills in each specific policy area. And that's part of the reason why we had to use such a specific range of years, because we actually needed years of consistent control by a single party in order to get enough bills in enough issue areas, because there's a ton of variation in what actually gets to the floor in terms of policy areas. And then so from those individual measures for individual legislators across issues, we aggregated to the party. And this, the like methodological assumptions follow a lot of the work that's been pushing on nominate over the past few decades. That suggests that it might be a better measure of things like teamsmanship or how much you vote with your party. A good example recently is that in her first Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was, by nominate, one of the most moderate members of the Democratic Party, because she votes against her party because they're not liberal enough. But that, those types of edge cases tend to get wonky with nominate. And so we're actually exploiting those issues with the scaling method to get ideas of how much heterogeneity there is across parties. And then with motivation, we use president's priorities during during periods of divided government. Sorry, this typo there. Using the Policy Agendas Project coding of the State of the Union addresses. We tried doing this a bunch of different ways, and this was the best that we could figure out in terms of getting reliable metrics for this. So in the analyses that use that metric, it cuts out, I think, the 103rd, the 107th, 8th, and 9th Congresses. So next. So this real quickly is the distribution of these heterogeneity measures, the spread of the majority party and the minority party across issues for the Democratic majority and the Republican majority. And as you can see, we put these dotted lines here for the median in terms of the majority and the minority spread to say, like, where is the majority party relatively more unified or ununified, the minority party as well. And what we expect is that when the minority party is particularly unified and the majority party is ununified, that's when you're going to see more minority party influence, and also when it is a priority for the minority party. So next. And then we also include a bunch of covariates, and we can talk about these in the Q&A if folks want, at a bunch of different levels. So next. So this is our first result. This is just looking at opportunity cohesion, the within across issue spread in the minority party and the majority party, and the probability of getting a vote. I could show you regression tables; they're huge, but they're in the paper. And so what we see here is consistent with our theory, right? When the minority party is more unified, so low and high are one standard deviation below and above the median on both dimensions there. When the minority party is particularly unified, as the majority becomes less unified, the probability of coming to a vote increases. And then when parties that there are medians, there's a little bit of an effect, but it's not statistically significant. And then when the minority is ununified, the majority party can have more of an influence as it is less unified as well. So this is all consistent with our theory. So next. And then we also consider when things are a minority party, and you know, this inverted U shape is kind of what we're looking for here. So we don't find that particularly there is not much of an effect of minority party unity when there is not a priority for the minority party, particularly in such a way when we would expect the minority party to be advantaged, which is fitting with it. You know, if the minority party doesn't have motivation to engage in policy making, then they're not going to exert as much influence. Then when the minority party does have a vested interest, we see that same inverted U shape, where when the minority is pretty unified, probability of getting to a vote increases as the majority becomes less unified, and vice versa. Next. And then finally, we actually also find this in terms of what becomes law. So particularly when there is a minority party priority, things are much more likely to become law when the minority party is more unified as a function of majority party spread. And particularly interestingly, there is less of an effect of majority party unity when the minority party is less unified in this for the probability of becoming law. And then so as a robustness check on the next slide, we also showed the probability of what becomes law conditional on only subsetting to bills that passed the House. And here we see the same effect for when the minority part, where there's a minority party priority and the minority party is relatively unified, right? The probability of becoming law increases as a function of majority party spread. But that's true no matter what the level of minority party unity is there. And of course, we don't really ever find substantial effects for when the minority is not prioritizing a particular issue. So next. Just wrapping up, this has a lot of implications for our prominent theories of party power, right? The majority party often does not block bills that divide it. When it's not unified, then a lot of things, this is actually an opportunity for the minority party to influence legislation. And the majority is not more likely to set the agenda on items that unify it when the minority is unified in opposition. Particularly the parties, you know, they have a vested interest in picking and choosing their battles very carefully, right? And instead we find that the minority party has substantial influence over the legislative agenda. Now and there are lots of other implications, lots of threads that we're pulling on in other papers, and I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion as well. But that's it for me. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Let's go on to the second paper. This is by Erinn Lauterbach. Erinn, are you on?
I'm here. Do you hear me?
Got you.
Okay.
All right, thanks.
All right. My name is Erinn Lauterbach. I am currently a postdoc at the Center for Effective Lawmaking, working with Alan and Craig, who are also on the call. And then if you go to the next slide. So this is a working paper that stems from my dissertation, and in that the overall motivating question is simply kind of how do legislators achieve their policy goals? But in this section in particular, I'm interested in the link between descriptive and substantive policy representation. So I narrow it to this question of, do women draft bills differently when they legislate on women's issues? I do want to note from the beginning that I'm only looking at bill introduction stage and not the full policymaking process, but I think this is an ideal place to start to better understand the impact of both institutional and extra institutional factors that affect the bill writing process, which can help us understand additional characteristics of legislative effectiveness as conceived of by Volden and Wiseman, and kind of as we're talking about in this workshop or set of workshops. So I bring together several literatures, including work on institutions, public policy, and elite behavior, but there's a couple core things to keep in mind. First, there's ample research that shows that members of Congress are motivated by multiple goals, including the goal to make good policy. Entrepreneurship research shows us that proactive participation, like introducing legislation, signals that a legislator cares about the issue, and delegation and discretion literature provides at least some evidence that when they care about the issue, or when there's high stakes legislation, that members of Congress will work on actually policy making themselves rather than delegating those decision makings to downstream political actors like bureaucrats or the courts, right? And then finally, work on representation and women in politics provides ample evidence that women express an interest in representing women, that they believe that their gendered experiences give them a unique perspective that's often lacking in the policymaking process, given their underrepresentation in Congress, and that they behave differently from men in a lot of contexts, especially in the agenda setting context. In other words, they're more likely to introduce legislation that pertains to women's issues than men. So taking this all together, this paints a picture that suggests that when women choose to participate in the policymaking process by introducing legislation that pertains to women's issues, that they should work to limit the discretion that downstream actors have when they are working on interpreting, implementing, and enforcing the laws that are written. So they wouldn't be able to do this with all legislation because resources are scarce, especially in the House. And so in effect, I'm arguing that because women have certain experiences, for example, they may have been paid less than their male colleagues before coming to Congress, that they have these experiences and that they want to fix the law. And so they're more likely to put more policy content in their bills in order to kind of limit the discretion and shirking of downstream actors so that they can make real policy change, okay? And I do want to be clear here that I know that there is no, that women are not a monolithic group in American politics, and there is no kind of women's experience, but for brevity here, I'm kind of making that broad generalization, and I'm happy to talk about those things in question and answer. So if you want to go to the next slide. In the paper that I circulated, I test 3 hypotheses, but the overarching pattern that I expect to see in the data is that women will include more policy content, so they'll have higher policy content scores compared to their male colleagues when they introduce women's issues, okay? So I test this at the gender party level to show that this isn't just a partisanship story masked by imbalance of women in the Democratic Party or by the fact that Democrats tend to own women's issues more than Republicans. And I also look at subcommittee membership because this is the best place for men to kind of overcome the experience gap because they have more advantages from the institution to work to represent women. So I test these hypotheses using an original data set that I created in my dissertation of policy content scores. And I'm happy to answer questions about how I did this in Q&A, but for now, the data is at the bill level. So I coded for different policy tools, so like punishments, incentives, and oversight tools in 13,770 bills that were introduced into the US House between 2005 and 2012. This is the 109th or 112th Congress. And so overall, there are 12 tool types that fall under these categories of incentives, punishments, and oversight. And so the score is additive and it ranges from 0 to 12, where 0 means that none of the tools were present in the legislation. So you might want to think of this as like extreme messaging legislation. And 12 would be that all of them were included. And the average is around 4 for the bills in the data. So these scores are important because as part of my overall argument, I posit that higher policy content scores can be thought of as members trying to limit the amount of discretion that they delegate. And given the scarcity of resources, writing bills with higher scores is more resource intensive and therefore a proxy for their attempt to create good policy and achieve their policy goals. So the next slide. So just to give a quick example of kind of what I'm talking about to show you here. These are 2 hypothetical bills introduced on the topic of sexual assault in the military. And if we were to use the most common way to distinguish bill content, especially in the gender literature, we would use bill topic codes. And so even when using very detailed topic codes, like something from the Policy Agendas Project, where they have over 200 subtopics, both of these bills would still be categorized as sexual assault in the military, even though one just kind of sets up an advisory group to study and do a report on the issue, while the other actually sets punishments and mechanisms for adjudicating and reporting incidents. And another way to measure the content would be using word counts like Huber and Shippen do, but these differences would only be distinguishable if the length were different. Using my measure, however, given what's presented here, legislator A's bill would get a score of 3, and legislator B's bill would get a score of 5. So they're showing that there is some difference here between these 2 bills. One is doing more than the other. Okay, next slide. And so then just kind of overall, right, the results broadly show that women do in fact include more policy content compared to similarly situated men on women's issues. And in the paper, I show some mixed evidence for the individual hypotheses, but overall, women tend to include about half a tool type more policy content than men in general on women's issues. Then their male co-partisans, or even more for Republican women. And then also compared to men in similar institutional positions. So being on the subcommittee doesn't really help men overcome the experience gap when they're on women's focused subcommittees, which I'm happy to talk about what that means in question and answer. So I argue that these are not only statistically significant differences, but they are also substantively significant. So half a tool type doesn't seem like much, but the way that the measure is created, it's you only get a point for having each of these types of tools in there. So this is not just that women include 2 reports, whereas men only include 1 in the bills that they write. It's that there's an additional type of incentive, oversight, or punishment in the bills that men are not including. And so if we think about the implications of this, I think that this is a more direct test of the association between descriptive and substantive policy representation, at least at the agenda setting stage, than simply looking at things like bill topics. And so this kind of confirms most of the assumptions that are made in the literature, but it tests them a little bit more directly. And then we have questions about the links to legislative effectiveness, right? Which I'm happy to hear if you guys have ideas about this. I'm finishing up a coding project where we're looking at the bills as they move through the process, so not just introduced bills. And then in my work with Craig and Alan at the center, we'll start to kind of look at what are the associations between writing bills with high policy content and legislative effectiveness as they conceive it. And then, it gets at questions of legislative capacity and Congress's role in the policymaking process, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. And I think I'm out of time there, so thank you.
Thank you for being respectful of time, Erinn. Appreciate it. All right. And last but not least, Peter, Craig, and Alan have a paper on legislative effectiveness in the states. I'm not sure who will be speaking, but I'll let you go.
I'll take the lead. So first of all, thank you all for inviting us to participate in this. Craig and I are really excited to get your reactions to this paper. This paper is co-authored with Peter Bucchianeri, who's a recently, I wouldn't say departed, but recently having left the Center for Effective Lawmaking as a postdoc, and he's currently looking for gainful employment as well. And we're very much in debt to him for all of his efforts to make this project and a bunch of related projects that we're working on with him come to fruition. So in this paper, we're essentially trying to explore or engage in analysis that's analogous to what we've done for the United States Congress to explore the determinants of lawmaking effectiveness among state legislators in the United States state legislatures. You could go to the next slide there. So in the interest of time, I'm going to just do a very quick overview of what we're doing here, as well as present some main findings, and hopefully this will serve as fodder from some useful question and answer afterwards. But just to give you a preview of what we're doing in this paper, we essentially generate state legislative effectiveness scores for 97 state legislatures, which are all but Kansas. For those of you, anyone here from Kansas can testify to this, but we didn't realize it until we started the project. Then the state of Kansas in the legislature, it's very rarely the case that individual members are actually attached to bills as sponsors. In fact, interesting piece of trivia, they actually go out of their way to make it pretty difficult to identify the actual sponsor. So for our purposes, we just decided to put them aside. Analytically, we're using essentially the same approach that Craig and I used to generate legislative effectiveness scores for the US Congress, both in our initial book as well as subsequent work. And the data that we draw on in these state legislatures are from 1987 up until 2018. Some states are in the data set for the entire period, some for only more recent periods, and some for intermediate chunks. But in total, this brings us to over 1,000 legislative sessions and over 80,000 scores through 2018 across these 97 legislative chambers. And hopefully this was a particularly appealing project to comparative politics scholars in the sense this is very comparative in nature. We're using these data sources to explore various determinants of lawmaking effectiveness across different chambers based on personal and or institutional features of individual legislators themselves, as well as the features of the legislature itself in terms of its rules, its institutional capacity, and the like. In the paper that we all circulated, we illustrate the efficacy of these scores, the broader usefulness of them for engaging with various research programs by conducting 3 relatively short studies. One is focusing on the scope of majority party influence in a chamber. The other is focusing on the relationship or differences between the relative lawmaking effectiveness of men and women lawmakers in a chamber. And 3 was exploring the relationship between various aspects of institutional designs, such as the extent to which staff are compensated, whether or not it's a full versus part-time legislature, various rules that the legislature operates by, and how that maps into individual lawmaking effectiveness of members who serve within these state legislatures. For the purposes of discussion today, however, I'm going to focus our attention on points 1 and 3, and we're not going to comment on the gender study, but we'd be happy to respond to any questions and would love any feedback or gut reactions you have. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So as I said before, in terms of generating the state legislative effectiveness score, we're engaging in a method that's very analogous to what Craig and I did with Congress. That being, we're using all available data that we could draw from publicly available state legislative websites. We essentially link every public bill, and by that we mean bills that could actually change state law rather than just basically being honorarium announcements. We link each bill to every sponsor in every legislative chamber. Sometimes, as you can imagine, this is difficult to track down, even in states unlike Kansas. We identify how far a bill advanced through different stages of the lawmaking process. And similar to what you might expect if we compare the U.S. Congress to these different state legislatures, each state incorporates its own legislative language within the public record. So we had to spend quite a bit of time trying to ferret out what different legislative steps meant or how they're actually captured within the bill text. We also want to account for the relative substantive importance of the bills. The language of the bill also, and by that I mean the titles of the bills, we're able to identify which bills largely encompass what we refer to as commemorative measures. And it's also the case that any bill that was identified as being the focus of newspaper coverage, either at the national level or more often within the state papers themselves, we denoted as being substantively significant, and everything else was essentially viewed as a rank and file, substantively oriented bill. Next slide, please. So to give you a preview of where we're going with this, after generating all these individual scores, we could obviously look at the ways in which these scores vary across a variety of descriptive characteristics of the members. This figure here presents the legislative effectiveness scores for each state legislator as organized by majority versus minority party, where the blue histograms here represent, or the blue distributions represent the majority party in a given state legislature, either the House or the Senate. The green represent the minority party. And we've organized in such a way that those states at the top, such as Arizona, for example, represent states for which the difference between the majority and minority party advantage with regards to legislative effectiveness, so to speak, is most substantial. Compared to, if you go all the way down, the state of Louisiana, for example, there's basically de minimis difference between the average majority and average minority party member with regards to lawmaking effectiveness. They're almost indistinguishable from each other. And the question we had was, if we think about this variance, the scope of variation among the average majority minority party member in each of these state legislatures, what contributes to or perhaps is related to these differences. So if we go to the next slide, please. If we think back to Andrew's point regarding the determinants of, essentially majority party influence or strength in the American Congress, we know there's a wide array of literature that we could draw on from congressional studies to motivate our hypotheses for what might possibly contribute to or perhaps detract from the relative lawmaking effectiveness of majority versus minority party members. The dependent variables that we are looking to analyze, one we refer to as state legislative effectiveness partisan differences. And that's essentially the difference between the median majority party member and median minority party member in a given chamber in regards to their legislative effectiveness. So when this difference is very, very large, that means the median majority party member is notably more effective on our scale than the median minority party member. And we're also looking at another dependent variable, which is the share more effective. And that's essentially the proportion of majority party members that are more effective vis-a-vis their state legislative effectiveness scores than minority party members. And we're looking to see the extent to which these differences are related to whether or not the parties are ideologically polarized and or whether or not the majority party is ideologically homogenous, which would be consistent with conventional arguments a la conditional party government theory, vis-a-vis Aldrich and Rhodey. and also embracing more recent scholarship, such as that by Francis Lee, that speaks to the relationship between insecure majorities and majority party influence. We're also looking to see whether or not it's the case that when majorities are somewhat tenuous, such as the chamber is relatively evenly divided between the majority and the minority parties, is it the case that majority party members tend to be notably more effective than minority party members? Largely because, consistent with Lee's argument, in these more tenuous settings, the majority party wants to make sure the minority party really can't generate anything that is analogous to a win, okay? What we find in analyzing our data is that both these perspectives are supported across a wide array of data. In fact, the overwhelming majority, or the lion's share of what constitutes what we've identified as the majority party advantage in these different state legislatures is largely a function of it occurring in legislatures for which majority parties are relatively homogenous and the parties themselves are quite polarized, as well as situations in which the party balance between the majority and minority is relatively tenuous. So in the bluntest terms, when the majority party has just barely enough seats to constitute the majority party in comparison to the minority, we actually expect the majority party advantage in lawmaking effectiveness to be greatest, ceteris paribus. Moving on to the next slide, please. The next hypotheses, or set of hypotheses we want to explore, is to take a look at the ways in which different chamber level institutional variables actually map into the individual lawmaking effectiveness of members. So for example, is it the case that perhaps legislatures that are professionalized, meaning they meet a lot of days a year, those for which they pay their staff well, those for which they pay members well, those for which members actually have dedicated staff or shared staff, likewise, those for which, say, the majority party actually has gatekeeping authority over the floor, those states or probably those state legislatures in which there's a lot of legislative committees, how do each of these different factors relate to the individual lawmaking effectiveness of members within their chambers? So to explore these relationships, we conduct a series of regression analyses where the dependent variables consist of the following. One is the variable I just described, that being the median difference between the majority and minority party members. Another variable that we look at is to look or explore the difference between the median male member of the chamber and the median female member of the chamber to see how these institutional variations correspond to differences in the effectiveness of men versus women. We also look to see the difference between the relative effectiveness of chairs versus rank and file members, and that's captured by the SLES chair difference. And then finally, we look to see how what the scope of the difference between, say, freshman members, people in their first terms in the chamber, and more senior members, that being anyone who's been elected more than one term, how those lawmaking effectiveness differences map into or are related to these changes in institutional variations across these different legislatures. So moving on to the next slide, please. So what we find is relative to the average member, higher salary as well as office spending clearly empower rank and file members and freshman members compared to either chairs or more senior members of the chamber. We find that those legislatures that meet for longer sessions tend to empower majority party members in comparison to minority party members, as well as committee chairs in comparison to rank and file members, as well as freshman members of the chamber in compared to more senior members. We find that providing for well-paid staff for members themselves empowers rank and file members over committee chairs, which is consistent with broader arguments about the ways in which bolstering institutional capacity can help facilitate lawmaking effectiveness in chambers. We find that once you dive into the procedural differences across legislatures in the United States, that gatekeeping and agenda sending procedures that are actually dictated within the standing rules of these chambers unambiguously empower majority party members as well as committee chairs. We find that the institution of term limits within these different state legislatures seems to empower minority party members in comparison to majority party members, as well as freshman members in comparison to more senior members, which makes sense. And if you think about the fact we'd expect that the imposition of term limits would lead there to be a smaller seniority advantage in lawmaking effectiveness compared to those states that don't have term limits. And that's exactly what we find. And interestingly, we also find that those state legislatures that have relatively more legislative committees seem to correlate with state legislatures in which female lawmakers are relatively more effective than in those state legislatures, which is a relatively smaller number of legislative committees. So moving ahead to the final slide, please. All said, we like to think the state legislative effectiveness scores offer a variety of new research opportunities, both within the American states, as well as hopefully providing a model for those that are interested in engaging in comparative research on legislative effectiveness. So thanks in advance for any questions or comments you have.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for very quick presentations. I know you had to move quickly, but most everybody will have read the papers. I'm struck in hearing the presentations by the amount of very good questions that are useful just for thinking about the US case, obviously, but also the Latin American case, which is of such interest to all of us. I don't yet see any questions in the chat, but I'm certain that there are people who have questions, and I saw a hand moving, and indeed it was a hand. So David, thank you. You're good to raise your hand. I will play the role of moderator here, ask you to keep your questions concise so that we can move on and collect as many questions as possible. But I do suggest that we perhaps do a question and a response until we get a tidal wave of questions, in which case we'll start bunching them up. David Barker, please.
Okay, thanks a lot. I had a few different questions or comments, but in light of what you just said, Matthew, I'll just restrict mine to one question for now on the Ballard and Curry paper, which I learned a lot from, by the way, and I think I'm probably the only person in this group who is not, in fact, a legislative scholar, really. So I learned from all these papers, but also I did want to, it might not surprise you, Andy, that part of my question has to do with ideology, but first of all, one of the things that was a struggle to me in really understanding where the paper was coming from is understanding the distinction between on sponsorship, right? And so in terms of minority party influence or power, it seems to me like, well, part of that is the ability to get your bills on the floor and coming to a vote and passed. But the other part is your ability to block the majority's bills. And both are expressions of power or influence. But I wonder if that makes any difference in terms of any of your models. As I was trying to understand them, I kept having to, my brain was jumping back and forth between trying to understand which would be which.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a question that we considered in a different paper, much more explicitly. This branch of research started from, I mean, honestly, it was like a throwaway graph in the last chapter of my dissertation that I was scrambling to put together a few years ago, where I found that the proportion of bills that received a vote in Congress in the last 30 years that come from members of the minority party has increased about fourfold. And started thinking, okay, well, that means that we need to understand this more. And particularly one of the things that we've been looking at is okay, well, does the sort of rate of introduction, because yes, obviously the majority party has particularly a lot of procedural advantage, right, in Congress. But what we're trying to distinguish between are one, between sort of procedural advantage and substantive advantage. And this is what a lot of the work that we're doing now in subsequent papers is on. And two, does procedural advantage lead to substantive and measurable outcomes that are advantageous to the majority party? And that what this is normally measured as is how often does the majority get rolled, which is such a really high bar. You would almost never expect that to happen, and of course we almost never find that it does happen. But that there's a lot of gray area in between. And so one of the things that we've shown is that this sort of increase of the minority party's share of the agenda holds whether you consider, how many bills members introduce or what the relative power is for, what the relative difference in power is for the majority versus the minority in the number of bills introduced. And when you consider the holding of various key pivot points like in committees and in the speakership and things like that. So I mean, it's a very complicated question.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So is your sense that that is a variable that is worth controlling for or interacting with any of the variables that you have in this paper?
Sorry, which particular variable? You cut out there.
Majority versus minority sponsorship.
Oh, yeah. So that is one of the variables that we have in there.
I missed it. Okay.
It's just an indicator for whether a member's in the majority or not.
Gotcha.
I don't, Andy, you had your hand up, but I think,
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Yeah, I was really interested in Craig and Alan's paper because one of the things that is part of this work on party influence is, we have a lot of institutional ideas, but the institutions in Congress are relatively invariant. And so you need to go somewhere where there's variance, and there's a lot of variance at the state legislatures in terms of institutions. And so I have a paper that Jim and I are working on also with Mary Krager at UNC that where we're trying to test some of those like more explicitly institutional aspects of this theory. And we've run into a bunch of the same data problems that you described in your paper. And I was just wondering, particularly on 2 points, how you were able to deal with one, the idea of like committee sponsorship. So we found that like a little bit less than 1% of the bills in our sample are committee sponsored, but that there's a ton of variation across states where like in some cases, more than half of the bills are sponsored by committees, although that's pretty rare. And you talked about that a little bit, but I was wondering if you could expand upon the exact process by which you did that. And then the second part, you've got the 5-fold indicator for how far a bill gets introduced, received action committee, beyond committee, passed the chamber, and became law. And we found that there's a lot of trouble getting from 3 received action beyond committee to passed, where there are lots of bills that show passage, but no roll call vote. And like, obviously lots of chambers have indications for unanimous consent agreements and voice votes and things like that. And actually we're using the Legiscan data largely, which for some reason, if there's a vote that is not a unanimous consent agreement, but there is no dissent, so no nays, they just say that there wasn't a roll call, which is a little weird. But so we've been digging into that, and I was wondering if you had run into similar issues and how you dealt with that as well.
Great. Why don't we get a quick answer, and then we have a couple more lined up for questions.
Sure, let me just answer gut reactions, then Craig could pop in as well. The point about committee sponsorship is an important one. And I guess the quick answer I'd say is it's going to matter quite a bit based on the state. So what we found is, and one of the reasons why, bluntly speaking, it took about 2 years to get this data amassed is because in addition to pulling it all from publicly available record, and by we, I mean Peter, in the interest of full disclosure, Peter would spend a lot of time on the phone with people in these different state legislatures to find out exactly what meant what. So with respect to the committee sponsorship, in some cases, the equivalent of the clerk of the state legislature said that it was fair, reasonable, and appropriate to basically identify the first sponsor who was listed or the committee chair as essentially analogous to an individual sponsor, even though it was still being designated as a committee bill. In some cases, that wasn't really clear, in which case some portion of the data we ended up discarding altogether, as you said. And it's going to vary state by state, and we annotate it in pretty detailed format. Likewise, the same holds true for any ambiguity regarding when things passed, basically. But we weren't just drawing stuff from the legislature. I mean, a lot of the stuff is coming directly from the states themselves. So I'd have to compare exactly what our data sets were to yours. Craig, do you have anything to follow up with that?
Yeah, so we went state by state as opposed to through Legiscan, and so that allowed us to pick up some specific language that was going on there. In many cases, just tracking down who was shepherding the bill on the floor was able to isolate who the bill sponsors were in those committee cases, and then again, lots of calling around to making sure that we were coding those up correctly. once we get this all locked down, we're happy to share or anything that would be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be amazing because this is a huge effort that y'all have gone through. So thanks for that.
Yeah, I'm impressed by the numbers. Eric, you were the next on the list.
Yeah, well, thank you, Matt. And first of all, thanks on behalf of the center for to all of the presenters and for all of you for joining us. Dave Barker mentioned in framing his question that he's not a legislative politics specialist and that perhaps he was the only one. I want to reassure him he's not the only one. I'm less of a legislative politics specialist than he is. So on the one hand, I've been able to learn a lot from this. But I'm also thinking about your findings from a little bit outside of this area of scholarship. And I'm struck by thinking about how easily these analyses travel to Latin American political systems and where your methods can map on productively to party dynamics and legislative dynamics in the region, and where the dynamics in the region make things particularly complicated. So when I think about Erinn's paper, I can see this really being a powerful tool for understanding the consequences of measures that a number of Latin American countries have taken to ensure gender participation, gender representation in legislatures and the like. One could imagine extending it to issues, for example, of Afro-descendant populations or constitutions that have reserved seats for indigenous peoples. And so it seems to me this is hinting at an agenda for research that probably is already underway, but that it just seems to me to be very instructive. I think similarly, the sorts of things that Peter, Craig, and Alan are looking at in terms of the implications of legislative characteristics, like whether there's paid staff, how frequently they meet. Those are variables that we can think about both within and across Latin American countries. One of the things that has always struck me as very vexing about taking the US literature, which of course is very advanced in comparative terms, taking the US literature and trying to apply it in Latin American context is something that was driven home to me listening to Andy's paper, is Latin America almost nowhere has these two-party systems, right? So much of the legislative politics literature, it seems to me in the US, is built on a frame that takes for granted two strong political parties and only two parties. And I'm just wondering what thoughts you have, Beatrice. I'm sure you've thought about this, just about where this field gets stuck when you try to apply these frameworks to Latin America and when it still works. Thank you.
Great. We suddenly got the avalanche of questions that I was imagining we would get. And so I'm going to take advantage of my prerogative here and ask that we collect two more questions. And the next in line are Danielle and then Leslie. If you could ask your questions and then we'll go to the panelists.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Danielle Thompson, assistant professor at University of California, Irvine. Thanks for such interesting papers. I guess I'm limited to my questions here. So I have a couple of questions for both Peter, Craig, and Alan, as well as Erinn, and particularly with respect to the gendered part of Peter, Craig, and Alan's paper. So I'll just start with Craig and Alan. So one thing I think is really interesting about this paper is that it both illustrates one of the things like a tension in the literature that I've thought is always there, which is, so Mary Hawksworth's like pretty foundational APSR article in 2001 talked about how women of color in Congress have experienced marginalization, silencing, exclusion in committees, which the logical sort of conclusion would be that they were less effective. But then there's a host of other research, some of which you did, that shows women are more effective. And here you kind of show both. And I think that that is a puzzling but also interesting finding of the paper. So in particular, this difference across chambers, that women in lower chambers are less effective and women in upper chambers are more effective. So it got me thinking about, what you could do to look at some of the reasons for why. So I think that you could check whether women in in upper chambers were more likely to come from lower level office than men. So is it the case that these kinds of women are getting more training or more experience before entering office, similar to what we see at the congressional level, with women who run for Congress being more experienced than their male counterparts? So how are these differences sort of explained by patterns of entry and experience that we know are true at other levels of office? And then for Erinn's paper, I really like this project a lot. It's a ton of work, and I really like how you so clearly go through your expectations and your hypotheses and your findings. It's really well laid out and well done. So one of the things that I think that you could do a little bit more is develop or sort of create a foil. And you kind of mentioned this in your talk, that you're sort of echoing findings that we would expect to see. And I think that that's true, but I think there's also ways that you could push the data a little bit more to challenge or to differentiate between expectations. So the one I'm thinking of most is what kind of role electoral concerns play versus non-electoral considerations. So we expect that, like with an Onzi and Berry framework, to see women writing even more in more conservative districts. But so Craig and Alan in their paper with Dana Whitmer have a really nice section looking at contrasting their results with Onzi and Berry. And I think you could do something similar in your paper. So my guess is that you would not see differences based on the electoral considerations, because that's not really the argument that you're making here. But it would be nice to kind of push this a little bit more to test where we might see differences and where your argument could contrast with other theories. But I will stop there.
Okay.
Thanks for these papers.
Leslie, if you wouldn't mind waiting, I think there's enough there, and then we'll come back to you. Thank you. I will throw it up. Why don't we go in the order that the questions seem to, why don't we go in the order of the speakers, actually, starting with Eric's comparative question. Andy, you want to give it a shot?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's an interesting question of how the dynamics that we're talking about in this paper and the broader work would map onto a PR, like an open PR system or a list PR system where there are multiple parties. I think that a lot of these dynamics would break down just because the bargaining space is a lot larger and more fluid. But you also have governments like the UK, where just to use an example of something that I know a little bit better, that is a little bit more of a multi-party system, where I think that these types of things, these dynamics would map on pretty well. And the distinction there, at least as I'm thinking about it right now, seems to be how solid are the coalitions in the government, and how strictly do the coalitions hold their members to certain agreements. So I mean, that maps around really easily to this idea of cohesion, right? And opportunity. But so the combination of that plus the procedural control of agenda setting issues, I think would mean that there is at least room for like a flavor of this type of analysis in Latin American countries as well. Thinking about it at least through the framework of, okay, well, when would you expect the opposition to be able to influence what the government does?
Wonderful. I mean, one of the key questions in Latin America, of course, is the extent to which the opposition in multi-party systems behaves like an opposition, or whether they're co-opted in some way. Okay, Erinn, would you like to answer any of the questions that you received?
Sure. So one of the things I think that came up in the discussing comments in the last workshop last month from kind of both Danielle and Leslie were these kinds of questions of what do these assumptions in American politics make, and how do they transfer, right? And so I think Leslie, it was you. I might be getting this backwards, but you know, what are the incentives for introducing legislation? So sometimes we know that they introduce legislation just for messaging purposes, right? They have no intent in actually passing the legislation, at least in the American context. I know this to be true, right? Versus, you know, there are times in which they're making policy to actually pass law, right? Because they want to change the policy or the status quo in some sort of way. And so I think by looking at kind of the policy tools that exist in the legislation, that's one way to kind of make these distinctions. And so if you know, if there are kind of policy tools, I don't know how well the work from the US and Canada, a lot of this work comes from Canadian scholars, like how well that kind of maps on, but you know, that's kind of one way I think we could get at this messaging versus non-messaging legislation. And then I think, Danielle, it was you that talked about different incentives for you know, introducing legislation, whether it be messaging or something else. And so I think that looking at kind of how much effort they're putting in at the introduction stage might be a way to get at, or at least I argue is a way to get at that effort. And so those things, you know, may be able to translate to work in Latin America, you know, and that can kind of be looked at regardless of how many parties or things that there are. So I thought that was really interesting from the first workshop. And then I think, Danielle, yeah, I think that there's so much to be done here. And so that's a great, I will look at those sections and I will keep that in mind. I don't think that it's just kind of an electoral phenomenon like Anthony, that's not just that women are better at this because they're better when they run. Because when we're looking at non-women's issues, you know, they're kind of at the same level as men. They're writing legislation with the same average scores. They're not doing this at kind of a they're doing this more. So it's not that they're doing it more all the time. It's that they're doing it more when it's on women's issues. And I'm sure, you know, I've got other working papers for things like class and stuff like that. So I'm sure we'll find other patterns, but at least in this pattern, they don't end up kind of being the same. But you're right, there's so much that I can do there, and I'll definitely look at that. And then just a quick note on the race part. I do have other stuff where I look at race, and I actually find that women of color aggregated, because there aren't that many of them, write even more than white women, both on women's issues and on issues that are kind of considered minority policy issues. And to me, this makes sense, or at least I argue that it makes sense, because they have kind of even more experience of being kind of marginalized by policy than white women do. And so they're doing this even more. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Alan or Craig or both?
Sure, I'm going to start rambling and I'll pass it on to Craig for a complimentary rambling maybe. Eric, I found your comments really interesting, especially given the ways in which Craig and I have been thinking about the extent to which anything we're doing naturally translates over to other political systems, obviously both in the United States as well as abroad. On the specific point you raised, that being, you know, to what degree is our research program or any of the research programs represented here largely dependent on the viability of a meaningful two-party system. I'm a little bit less concerned about that, and with regards to what we're doing, largely because we are focused at its heart, though, what we're trying to do is identify the extent to which individual legislators are more or less successful at advancing their own agenda items through the lawmaking process, and then identifying the extent to which that success might or might not be related to their party affiliation, meaning if they're in the majority or minority party. So if we were to do a similar exercise in a multi-party democracy or coalition democracy, you know, like we do still engage in theory with the same type of empirical exercise, then look to see whether or not being within the governing coalition is correlated with one's positive lawmaking success. I'd be surprised if it wasn't, but who knows? You know, I think the bigger issue or potential roadblock, perhaps, from translating our approach to other systems is really that first point that I raised, and that being the extent to which you feel comfortable saying that individual legislators have some agency in sponsoring their bills and moving it through the process, which in the United States, I think it's fair to say Craig and I are definitely comfortable making that assertion, and there's quite a bit of empirical research to suggest that they do have, that individual legislators do have that agency. Once you get to other systems where there's stronger parties in the chamber or stronger programmatic parties, that gets a little more questionable, and I think it's going to really vary based on the system. So obviously interacting with Beatriz with regards to Brazil, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to be one of our external committee members. So I've had a chance to learn a lot about Brazil and think about the extent to which anything that Craig and I are doing do translate over to that system, as well as Jan's work and others who were on the previous seminar with regards to the ways in which our work might translate over to Mexico or other systems. But at the same point, I think, to engage in some more exercise, we need to come up with empirical metrics that meaningfully capture what's going on in the process. Greg, do you have anything to add to that before I turn to Danielle?
Yeah, absolutely. It's obviously a fascinating subject. As scholars, I think more parties would be a lot more fun for a variety of reasons. But some that are coming to mind is just sort of, we've been looking at what's the relative effectiveness score for majority and minority party members. One could imagine relative effectiveness scores for different parties, different coalitions, and how that plays out. And I'd say particularly of interest across issue areas. Is it the case that there's deference to some parties in a coalition in some areas and differently in others? And I think that those have been increasingly of interest to scholars in this area. And then the second thing I would say is just building on what Alan was suggesting, is the main unit of action an individual? If not, if one has many parties, one could create party level effectiveness scores, sort of similar to what Alan and I are starting to do for committee level or even faction or caucus level within the US. And so those are showing kind of relative power dynamics in those different settings. And then I'll dive first into Danielle's question along those lines for the gender effects. I think you hit the nail on the head on this one. There are pressures going in both directions. Sometimes women seem to perform better, and sometimes they're more limited. And I think the reason Alan didn't present much of that is at present it's a muddled mess. Unless and until we can find what are the variables that are contributing to one of those directions and what are the variables contributing to the other direction, we're getting all kinds of findings, some of which I think are at present crazy. And so we're going to have to dive in and differentiate. I love your experience as one of those possible modifiers. There are probably others.
One crazy is really interesting, so we just need to explore more.
I'm sorry, I even cut you off a little bit, Alan. The gender results are very interesting.
They're interesting, but in the sense we just don't know what to make of them, as well as, given truthfully, there's such a wide variation in terms of the numbers of women legislators within upper versus lower chambers, as well as across all these different states. As currently presented, it's not entirely clear to us whether or not there's nonlinear effects as a function of the number of members in the chamber, and lots of other things we want to explore. So just our current plan actually is to pull the entire gender component out of the paper and do a different standalone paper that explores the comparative effects of the relative effectiveness of female lawmaking among all state legislators. So hopefully we could tease out many of the issues that Danielle's alluding to.
Wonderful. Leslie has been so patient. My dog wants to hear Leslie ask a question. I'm being attacked here. Beatriz, though, has asked for just a 2-finger on the last commentary, and then we'll turn to Leslie. If you'll be patient, just one more minute, Leslie.
Sorry about that, Leslie. So I just wanted to comment on the discussion about Latin America that Eric brought up, that I think is very important to me. I had a kind of a wrap-up comment that maybe I'll still say at the end of the meeting, but in relation to applying the Wiseman and Volden approach to other countries. What do we know so far? And here I'm referring basically to my own work and Ian Carvel's and Sergio's work that was presented in the previous workshop. But just that the majority party status that matters in the US, this effect washes away in different political systems. And my own work, being associated with the government coalition or the opposition doesn't seem to matter that much, or the results are very inconsistent. And so keep in mind that Brazil has a 30-party system. So I don't know at that point how we make a distinction there in terms of government coalition and opposition. And also Taeko Hiro is here, and her work with Lucio Renal talks about just how we also have to think about how cohesive the coalition is. And I think that's something that particularly in Brazil in recent years, we've seen a decline in cohesion in these coalitions. So there's all that in terms of being associated with the party that is part of the coalition of the opposition. Now, some of the institutional roles hold surprisingly well in Latin America. So you see the legislators who are party leaders and committee chairs are on average more effective than rank and file members. So that's something that is consistent between the US and Latin American countries based on research in Brazil and Mexico. The results for gender seem to be mixed. And here, Ian Kirvel is here, so if he wants to jump after me, I would be happy to hear his thoughts. In my work, gender does not appear as to explain effectiveness in both for the bill sponsor and the bill rapporteur. And I think the work in Latin America brings new dimensions, right? One of them is, to me, was super interesting, is the idea of the suplente, which is like a backup legislator that we elect through, in Brazil, through our open proportional representation system, that when the legislator wants to go work at the subnational level of government, he has a backup legislator that will take on his role. And these guys are consistently less effective than the legislators who are primarily elected. So that to me was very interesting. And also it's something that I think we should do more work on, which is informal institutions, right? And I try to do that with my work with legislative member organizations, or here in the US, we talk about them in terms of caucuses. But I think given the weakness of party systems and the number of parties, maybe these informal institutions are something that we can explore in terms of legislative effectiveness in these countries. Yeah, that's it. I don't know if Ian has something to add.
I have Ian on our list, but I'm going to go to Leslie now in the interest of being fair to everybody in the queue, and we'll come back, Ian, in a moment. But Leslie, thank you again for waiting.
Sure, no problem. Actually, some of my comments have already been discussed, so I will
I'm not sure if the problem is on my end. No, okay.
Sorry, that was my internet was unstable.
Okay, try again.
I should be good for another 15 minutes until it cuts out again. It seems to be about every 15 minutes I get this 20-second cutout. So, you know, in terms of how this idea of the power or the strength of the capacity of the minority party would play out in the Latin American context, I think one of the other challenges in that context as well is the fact that it's, you know, there's not a clear opposition, right? Because the opposition oftentimes is a number of different political parties. And so one of the things that I had thought about in terms of how you would map that onto a multi-party system would be if there's some way of using it to be able to determine which minority party is going to be the party that's going to benefit and when. So I almost think it has to be, I think it's a really interesting theory that Andrew and his co-author are working on. And I think it could apply to a multi-party system like we have in Latin America, but it would have to be something that took into consideration the fact that there isn't really even if you take into consideration coalitions, oftentimes it's not a governing party and opposition. It's a governing party and then multiple different opposition parties, and trying to figure, you know, if you could find a way to adapt that to be able to predict which opposition party is going to have the ability to contribute at different times would be really, really interesting. The other question that I have is for Erinn, although she answered my question before I even really got to ask it, which was I was going to come back to what we had talked about last time with this idea of the fact that legislators aren't always introducing legislation in order to sort of be effective as legislators. They often engage in it for symbolic reasons or for messaging, as you had mentioned. But it seemed to me in your paper that you were sort of making the assumption that they do care about the legislation. And if they care about the legislation, then they'll make it more detailed. And then the reason that women would do this more than men is because they care more about, women's issue legislation. But questioning if that's actually the case, makes me wonder if A, that's a valid assumption to make, but then your response before I asked the question was interesting as well, which sort of said that, well, maybe what this measure tells us is how symbolic or not the legislation actually is. So if they put a lot of time and effort into it and add all this detail to it, then that means that they care more about this legislation. But then my question would be, why would women be less symbolic than men? Because if that's what's actually going on, if your measure is telling us that and you're finding gender differences in it, then what we're really looking at is that women, because they put more content or detail into their bills, you're finding that women are less symbolic in their bill initiation patterns than are men. And that's kind of an interesting finding, but it really raises the question of why and what's going on there. And I think that that's different than really what you're arguing in the paper. So now I guess my question is, how would you reconcile those two things in your work? And then the third comment, just very quickly for Erinn, was really a small one, but I wondered, as I was going through the paper and then hearing you talk about it here, when you talk about policy content and you often talked about more and less, I think you were actually talking about like the amount, like how long the bill was. But what you really seem to be focused on is much more about the policy detail. So I'm wondering why you, and you can, answer this on the side, this is a pretty small, but I wondered why you talked about it as policy content instead of calling it something like policy detail. And those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay. Craig, would you like to add your questions to the hopper?
So my question was for Andy. I was intrigued by this idea of thinking about what are the priorities of each of the parties. In particular, I was wondering if we could get some leverage on that by simply the number of bills sponsored in an area by members of that party. So in other words, for the sessions where you have the president's bill or the president's State of the Union, do we see more of his party sponsoring bills in those areas? If so, that leads to two things. One is because they're sponsoring so many more bills, I think we saw that their overall passage rate was lower, which we would expect because there's way too many bills in that area. But second, for the times when you were deleting the Congress because you didn't have a president's State of the Union with the minority party, could this serve as a proxy in terms of the number of bills sponsored or the relative share or the share relative to prior Congresses, et cetera?
Wonderful. And then because we have only about 15 minutes left, I'm thinking Jan was also in the queue. And if he wants to throw his questions in, then everybody has about 5 minutes. I would point out also for Andy that there's a comment in the chat from Connie Schibber that is useful and particularly targeted to your paper, just so that you're aware of that. Jan?
Thanks. Yeah, so brief, I wanted to respond to one thing that Beatrice mentioned about the extent to which the findings from Volden and Wiseman travel to Latin America. And regarding women, we find that women tend to be more effective than men, but what we found is it's limited to women in the opposition, right? So not women from the governing parties. But I think what's different is we tend to find legislators from the opposition are always more effective, which is very, very different. So my question though was for Erinn. And I was really interested in your measure of policy content And I'm just wondering if you could talk about, what your measure means and what does policy content capture compared to, say, significance. So I just really liked what you were doing, and compared to, right, so a lot of the other work where we're measuring significance based on sort of external classifications, you're just using information within the bill itself. And so, is this something, because it's in our work in Mexico, we basically just use information from the bill to measure significance. And I think when we extend this type of work outside the US, it becomes really important to figure out how can we sort of consistently measure significance as part of measuring effectiveness. And so I was interested if you could speak to what it is you're actually capturing and how it's different than significance.
Great. Why don't we start, just to mix things up a little bit. Erinn, you were asked several questions there, and if you'd like to get us started.
Yes, I can do that. Okay. So I guess kind of starting with Leslie's questions. That's a good question, whether it's a valid assumption to make that women care about women's issues. And I can't get at kind of the underlying reason why they're doing these things. This is all observational data. But the bulk of kind of the representation literature underlying this is this assumption that because they at least tell people that they want to represent women, right, that that they care about these things. And so this is just kind of the underlying assumption that's being made. And I find in other work with Melinda Ritchie and Kenny Lowendy that, there is kind of more evidence out there that it is about their experiences and not just something that we say, right? So we find in a paper that was recently published in the AJPS that they're going to do this backdoor policymaking for women more often than men do and things like that. So it's just kind of an underlying assumption, and I would love a better way to get at that. But for now, I don't have it. So if you have suggestions, I would love to hear them. But as to why women would be less symbolic than men, I think it's because they're not introducing the bill just to write that press release that says I introduced a bill to help women, get equal pay, right? Women who have the experiences, trying to go to the EEOC know that it doesn't have any teeth, right? Or, the example that I use in the paper, women who, experience sexual violence on the Hill know that there isn't, a real adjudicating process. And so they're not going to even report that it's happening. And so they don't care about the symbolicness of introducing the legislation to help women. They care about actually making the policy change, which is why they're putting more tools in the bill to limit the amount of discretion that people downstream who have to interpret, implement, and enforce the laws, giving them kind of less leeway to, change what's happening from the original intent of the bill, is what I would argue there. And then for, policy content, I'm happy to hear other suggestions for what to call it. In my dissertation, I call it legislative incentivization, which is bad because incentive is one of the tools. Detail, I think, to me, it brings up ideas of specificity, but I don't think I can get at specificity the way that people like Rachel Van Sinklewoord do. So I don't want to step on that. Effectiveness, it's not what you think of when you think of Volden and Wiseman's work. So that's difficult. So I'm happy to hear other ideas if you have them for better ways to kind of name it. And I guess that kind of gets to Jan's question. So what am I trying to measure? What does this mean? What does this capture? So I think that, this is the thing that I'm struggling with the most, because what I am arguing here is that it captures kind of the amount of kind of leeway or discretion that other downstream actors have in trying to kind of implement or interpret, implement, and enforce the legislation. But I think that it reads a little bit better as this kind of messaging versus non-messaging distinction. So these are some things that I'm still trying to grapple with for, exactly what it is. And so, yes, I am using the bill itself to answer the question. But do you mean by significance, do you mean like substantive and significant versus messaging, kind of the way that Volden and Wiseman do? So I think that it gets at that in this idea that is it pure messaging, right? Because there are definitely bills that members of Congress introduce where they're like, I want to make sure that there is clean air by 2050. And then the rest of the bill just delegates to the EPA to do tests and figure out regulations, set standards. They may give deadlines and things for that, but really the tools that they're using in those bills are things like giving them deadlines and then also delegating to them what they can and can't do, and not saying like we want to decrease we want clean air by decreasing the amount of coal or something like that. They let somebody else decide. And so that would be kind of captured on the low end of mine, right? Because they're only putting in some of these oversight mechanisms. They're not putting in incentives in order to do it, or punishments if they don't necessarily, right? And if they do add in those things, then I think that they're getting at that they are really trying to make sure that the EPA is following through on their directives to make sure that there's clean air by 2050. So that's kind of what I'm picking up on here. So it's not exactly effectiveness, it's not exactly specificity, and it's not just the details, but it also includes those policy tools like adding in a criminal procedure or something like that. So the naming of it, I think, is an issue, and I don't want to take up any more time, so I'll just kind of leave it at that. Hopefully that answered your question. Thank you. Great question.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let's go now to Craig and Alan. I'm not sure which one of you would like to respond, if there were any things that you wanted to clarify.
I'll leave it to Craig. I think all the other, I thought maybe I misunderstood, but I thought all the remaining questions were directed more at the other papers at this point today. I mean, I appreciate the point that Jan was making regarding the clarification of Beatrice's point, and it's interesting to note that the extent to which he and his co-author find that women in the opposition are notably more effective than men. I mean, that's almost a one-to-one mapping between what Craig and I and Dana Whitmer-Wolf have already found in our published work as well, that it's the extent to which women are more effective lawmakers than men in Congress, in both the House and the Senate. It's women in the minority are more effective than more successful than their male counterparts, whereas in the majority, there's no appreciable difference, at least at Congress. But then, as Danielle noted, once we get to the state level, things kind of get all over the place in terms of different conditional relationships that we still need to tease out.
And my remaining comment is a big thank you to Beatrice and the center for bringing us all together. I mean, the opportunities to learn from one another, as we're seeing this time and a month ago, are immense. And I hope we keep these conversations going.
I agree. Thanks again for the invite.
That's a nice sentiment to end on, but I'm going to give Andy the final word here. Andy, you had a few questions directed at you. I'll let the floor.
All right, thanks. First, to Craig's question, that actually was one of the, or very similar to one of the ways that we tried to operationalize the priorities. But one of the things that we're trying to do is delineate between policy introduced at least plausibly for the reason to actually pass it versus messaging. And one of the things you often see Congress is that, a member will introduce the same bill every day, or not quite that extreme, but that for the purpose of messaging, there's a lot of, DOA type bills that are never meant to pass. And so just using the number passed, it could potentially conflate that. Another thing we tried was, so like the majority reserves the first, I think it's 10 bills for its leadership to lay out legislative priorities. And the first few floor speeches are often for majority leadership to lay out priorities. There aren't really an analogous thing for the minority to get their priorities out as well. And so what we ultimately ended on was this. I would be interested to see, and we didn't check this, how highly correlated the measure for using a measure like you suggested, where it's just the number of things that are introduced versus whether they're mentioned in the State of the Union. So that would be interesting. I mean, because if we're saying they measure the same thing, or at least they're plausibly measures of a similar thing, they should be pretty highly correlated. Which actually leads me pretty well into the question that Connie raised in the chat. Yeah, I was pretty surprised by those values too when we first ran these models. And if you have any other suggestions, so like first, I'll say what we've done to try and look at that. Like we looked at the potential problems with multicollinearity in all the models. There is one variable that is highly correlated with our majority spread variable, and that's the size of the House majority, so the number of seats that the House majority could lose before they became the minority party. And taking that out doesn't affect things. We also looked at the usual suspects for really high interaction effects, like outliers or unscaled variables, highly skewed variables, potentially rare events, lack of variation, and nothing really changed the model output. And so if the results that we're presenting are artificially inflated based on some sort of measurement, we haven't been able to find it yet. Which doesn't mean that we haven't done so, but at least to the degree that we can be sure, we are reasonably sure.
All right, well, wonderful. I want to end here by thanking everyone. Returning to both Eric and Craig's comments, it's been wonderful to think about some of the comparative application of this and at least begin the conversation. And so we really have to thank Beatriz for having organized us all, and also thank Katie Mount, Chris Cambu, Eric Hirschberg, and the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies for making this all possible. And I hope that this conversation can continue, and hopefully next time in person, no masks, and in a much more conducive setting to drinking caipirinhas or something like that, where we can discuss the comparative elements with great pleasure and joy. Pepper would like to say goodbye as well. But thank you all for your great papers and great questions and great participation, and many thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.